The increasing number and frequency of extreme weather events like droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes can all be partially blamed on climate change. Natural disasters have devastating effects on local and global communities. 22.5 million people are displaced each year due to extreme weather events, and this number is only expected to rise. A report by the World Bank predicts that 143 million people from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America could be displaced by weather-related catastrophes by 2050. Rising sea levels are expected to ruin coastal cities as we know them and force millions to move elsewhere. Cities like Jakarta, Lagos, and Venice are all at high risk of sinking by the end of the century due to rising sea levels. The consequences of a major city disappearing are huge. The amount of people who will need to relocate, compounded with the economic and cultural loss of a disappearing city, is quite frightening. Besides rising sea levels, climate change also causes extreme droughts which cut off food and water resources. It causes major hurricanes like Hurricane Dorian that devastated communities. It leaves many people without a home. It also causes more powerful tsunamis and hurricanes, making weather events more destructive and unpredictable. People who are displaced and forced to leave because of weather-related events are referred to as climate refugees or climate migrants. However, the term climate refugee does not exist in international law. Legally, climate refugees don't exist.
I have no choice, no other choice. If tsunami coming or high tides affecting our water, how can we survive for the future?
The UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, says that it is more accurate to refer to them as persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. The lack of an international term for climate refugees reflects the larger issue of a lack of international interaction in response to the growing number of climate refugees. The systems in place to support refugees are not designed for climate refugees. Today, work that focuses on climate refugees is comprised of guidance and legal advisory, policy promotion, and field-based activities. While they do provide assistance in terms of crisis, their work mostly focuses on policy and does not present a clear way to prevent or assist climate refugees. In December 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted by the UN General Assembly. This was an attempt to formally recognize the issue. However, it is a voluntary and non-binding agreement. The United States did not sign on. It does not lay out a concrete path to support the growing number of displaced peoples. It simply recognizes that climate, environmental degradation, and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. The fact that there is no plan for climate refugees makes it worrisome, given that the likelihood of a major city disappearing is pretty high. Nina Hall, a migration expert at Johns Hopkins University, notes that the wave of nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment that has swept across Europe and the United States in recent years has made it a challenge for the UN to even get governments to follow existing refugee protocol, let alone expand it to cover an entirely new class of refugees. Some of the difficulty in creating an international agreement may be because most displacements occur internally, with individuals moving from one part of their country to another. Its importance at an international level may be understated. The risk of displacement due to weather catastrophe is often measured by risk and vulnerability. Risk refers to how likely a weather catastrophe is in a region, simply based on factors like geography and closeness to water. Vulnerability takes into account factors such as development and wealth that makes weather disasters more intense with larger impacts. Less developed communities who rely on farming for sustenance, for example, are more affected by a drought than communities that have access to imported food. It is impossible to look at climate refugees without looking at it with a critical race theory lens. Those who are most affected by climate change are those who contributed little to the driving force of climate change. In fact, 90% of weather-related displacements occur within developing countries. In 2018, a severe drought in the northern provinces of Afghanistan forced 275,000 people to move, 50,000 more people than those displaced by the political conflict in Afghanistan. The drought affects the availability of wheat, one of the country's largest crops. Afghanistan produced 25% less wheat in 2018 than previous averages and was forced to tap into its grain reserves. Families found themselves starving with their animals and crops dead.
We're suffering a lot because of this drought. We had so many animals and we lost all of them. There's nothing left for us. These animals that are left, we are feeding just once a day. We're just trying to keep them alive.
Families live in tents outside seeking shelter donated by the UN and others in makeshift cloth tents. Parents and their children have become extremely malnourished and sick. Help from nonprofits and the UN food program have helped provide some food and resources, but the drought is ongoing and an estimated of 10.23 million people are currently food insecure. The drought is severely affecting millions of people, specifically people who rely on crops for their livelihood. Individuals who contribute little to climate change bear the cost, and the costs are extremely high because a drought of this nature has a massive impact on access to food, water, and income. On September 1st of this year, the Bahamas was struck by a Category 5 hurricane for over 48 hours, devastating the Abaco and Grand Bahama Islands and leaving at least 70,000 people homeless. Hurricane Dorian was unprecedented in its intensity and severity. Regardless, the strongest hurricane on record to hit the Bahamas, killing at least 50 and leaving upwards of 1,000 people missing. In the regions most affected by the storm, it is estimated that 90% of housing and infrastructure were destroyed, costing the country up to $7 billion in property damages. Nevertheless, response to the growing refugee crisis has been dismal. Although NGOs and USAID have been prominent actors in providing aid to displaced people in the Bahamas, there have been only reluctant efforts to take any of the climate refugees in neighboring countries. Confusion arose when hundreds of Bahamian refugees arrived in the US, searching for family members, medical attention, and a way to get back on their feet post-Dorian, but were turned away at the last minute due to changes in documentation requirements. The Trump administration has denied granting temporary protected status or TPS to Bahama residents, requiring them to apply for visas and fearing that an ease in immigration standards will allow some very, very bad gang members and some very, very bad drug dealers into the country.
You got some bad people in those groups, and I'll tell you what, this country doesn't want them.
Such a response is the product of the lack of standardized approach to dealing with the climate refugees. Highly vulnerable countries like the Bahamas will continue to suffer from the disproportionate effects of climate change without any real accountability on the parts of the main drivers of climate change. Countries like the United States will repeat their actions and simply shift the responsibility away. We believe that the climate refugee dilemma needs to be addressed head-on. The first step in doing so would be to redefine and recognize the term climate refugee. By doing so, not only would countries have to recognize that climate-induced migration is a broad phenomenon that defies existing definitions, they would also have to face the reality that climate refugees are not going away anytime soon. On the contrary, climate-induced migration is projected to dramatically increase due to an increase in the severity and frequency of climate disasters. The second step would be to change the laws and treaties regarding refugee management to reflect the unique circumstances that cause displacement. Given the unique nature of climate-induced migration, many climate refugees may never be able to return to the place of origin. Climate disasters may very well render some places uninhabitable, making the displacement of inhabitants permanent. As a result, international institutions need to prepare for an increasing number of climate refugees by coordination, capacity building, and integration between countries rather than simply providing foreign aid. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, is mandated to protect refugees broadly, and their actions therefore should reflect understanding and effort for climate refugees. The UNHCR should gain the authority to draft majority vote binding agreements to prevent empty promises and force countries like the United States to participate in rectifying the unequal and unjust effects of climate change. As reported by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, total new displacements caused by disasters amounted to 18.8 million in 2017. Clearly, what happened in Afghanistan and the Bahamas were not singular events. Climate refugees are real, and the current approach of refugee governance is failing them. Reform is needed in the form of a stronger central authority that recognizes the unique nature of climate refugees in response to climate-induced displacement.